year ago, most Canadians thought the next election would be fought on the issue of affordability or would be a referendum on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. But as 2025 got underway, Trudeau resigned, and Donald Trump was sworn in as U.S. president, threatening tariffs against Canada, mocking the country's viability, and openly calling for it to be annexed by the United States. All of that serving to change the ballot box question for Canadians and what they're looking for in the next Prime Minister.
There is the absolute imperative, given what's going on in the United States and will be for the next 4 years, we really need someone in that leadership chair as Prime Minister who's going to bring the country together and create that unified front that we're going to need if we're going to meet the challenges.
From 2013 to 2018, Kathleen Wynne served as Ontario's 25th Premier. And for her, whoever becomes the next Prime Minister will have to stand up for all of Canada as it tries to navigate uncharted and unpredictable territory.
We don't know exactly what's going to come at us, but we have to know what our story is, and we have to know where the federal government needs to know where all the provinces are on a whole variety of issues, whether it's energy, the fossil fuel movement in the West, or whether it's supply management in the East. You know, those issues are going to be part of the discussion over the next 4 years. So it's really important that we have that coordinated approach, not just this week or next week or this month, but over the 4 years. And that's kind of job number one for that partnership, I think.
U.S. President Donald Trump is also top of mind for former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, saying Trump just gave this country a kick in the pants and Canada can use this as an opportunity to do better.
You know, what the crisis with the Trump administration has underscored is how vulnerable we have become as a country. We took for granted our privileged access to the world's largest economy through NAFTA. We can't take that for granted any longer. We took for granted the need to be productive. We've seen this 2-3 decade long decline in our productivity. We're now going on 3 years with a steep decline in per capita GDP, which is our wealth. We are now no wealthier, measured by per capita gross domestic product, than the poorest of the 50 United States, Mississippi. There's something terribly wrong with that. So we should we just got a kick in the pants this past week with the Trump tariff threats. Let's use that to fix our own internal problems that are holding back Canada from a more prosperous future.
Alberta's premier from 2019 to 2022, Kenney also held several federal portfolios under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, a prime minister who was a strong advocate for the oil and gas sector. And for Kenney, it is that very sector that the federal government needs to champion again, because he argues it can create wealth and help Canada weather the Trump trade war.
When you think about Alberta and what it needs out of the next federal government, what would you say to that?
Well, it needs a federal government that respects the province and its most important industry, oil and gas, which is Canada's most important industry, Canada's largest industry sector, the largest creator of jobs, particularly of higher paying jobs, the largest contributor to the federal and provincial treasuries through tax revenues. And I think the recent trade disputes with the Trump administration have reminded Canadians about just how important oil and gas is. Certainly Donald Trump knows that, which is why he sought to impose a much lower tariff on Canadian energy than on other goods and services. We generate, Canada is the fourth largest oil producer in the world, the third largest reserves on Earth.
But up against that, as you know, is the opposition that builds around pipelines, for example, the building of them, the expansion of them, and that has to do with environmental concerns.
Well, I think there is a changing consensus. I think we even heard in the last few days some interesting comments by François Legault that perhaps the new Trump tariff context is going to persuade Quebecers to reconsider what has been fairly reflexive opposition to energy projects and pipelines, particularly natural gas.
Kenny references Quebec because back in 2013, what was then TransCanada Pipelines, now a part of TC Energy, proposed a $12 billion project that would have carried diluted bitumen from Alberta to the East Coast. But that project died several years later after opposition from Indigenous groups, environmentalists, and the provincial government in Quebec.
You know, I can tell you that in 2019, François Legault, I went out to Quebec City to meet with him as premier, and he said that for political reasons, he couldn't support an oil pipeline like Energy East, but he was very keen to move forward on natural gas, including large-scale LNG export facilities on the North Shore at the time, a project called Energy Saguenay that was being proposed. He actually asked me to come in behind that with Government of Alberta loan guarantees to help capitalize the project and get it moving. So I think he was right then, before he did a flip-flop in opposition to natural gas. Quebec knows, by the way, that they're, with electrification of the car fleet, with artificial intelligence, et cetera, that we're looking at a tripling of electricity demand over the next 2 or 3 decades in Canada. They're going to have a very hard time building large-scale hydroelectricity projects because of regulatory and political, Indigenous, and related issues. Quebec's never been big on nuclear, so if they don't do development of gas, which could also turn into a large job and revenue-producing LNG export industry, if they don't do that, they're not going to have power.
And LNG, or liquefied natural gas, is key because unlike the bitumen proposed more than 10 years ago, Kenny and others now picture an LNG line, which European countries, once dependent on Russian oil and still using coal-fired electricity plants, are asking for.
What's the alternative? You've got Europe, France, Germany, all of the European countries pleading for our natural gas, so that they can have a reliable alternative to Russian gas. And by the way, one thing that the card that we have to play is our relative proximity and shorter sail times for both our oil and gas products off our east and west coasts. Right now, Europe is replacing Russian LNG, Russian gas, I should say, off the Nord Stream projects by importing it from the U.S. Gulf Coast and from Qatar. Both of those are about a 20 to 24-day sail time to European ports. We could go straight across the North Atlantic in more like 7 days. Similarly, if we could build more LNG off the Northwest BC coast, or for that matter, some version of Northern Gateway oil pipeline, you're sort of an 8-day sail to Seoul, a 9-day sail to Tokyo, as opposed to 3 weeks or more coming out of the U.S. Gulf Coast and going through the Panama Canal. So, we are much more efficiently located geographically to be a major exporter of these products, in which we have enormous quantities. It just now takes the political will to get it done.
Kenny also makes the argument that oil, gas, and natural resources offer clear paths for diversifying our economy because so many countries around the world want them, not just the United States.
When you hear the current debate around trying to diversify the markets Canada can appeal to so we're not as dependent on our southern neighbor, is that oil and gas? Is that more? Is it primarily just oil and gas?
It should be all industries, and government should be supporting efforts to diversify export markets. But let me tell you, I'm a little, I won't say skeptical, but let me just say this. I was a member of the Harper government that worked really hard to diversify our export markets away from our massive dependence on the U.S. through a series of trade agreements. I think between the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Canada-Europe Trade Agreement, plus a number of bilateral agreements in which we entered into high-quality free trade agreements with some 40 countries between the TPP, the EU, and others. And yet, despite those good quality trade agreements, we have not seen an appreciable increase in Canadian exports of goods or services to those countries. Why? Well, here's the hard truth. We don't make a lot of things. And most of what we actually make, auto parts, aviation equipment, goes to the U.S. market. So, what is it that we have in ample supply with great value that the world wants most? Our energy, our oil and our gas. And for those who have concerns about emissions, here's the reality. The world, if Canada's not producing and shipping those products, other countries will. In the case of oil and gas, countries like Iran, Russia, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, none of which are democracies, some of which are state sponsors of terrorism, and all of which have lower environmental standards than Canada. So I say it's in the world's interest, both geopolitically, in terms of global peace and security, but also environmentally, for publicly traded, transparent companies operating in this liberal democracy at the highest environmental, human rights, and labor standards to become a larger source of energy. And I think the world realizes that, which is why we've had a parade of European leaders beating a path to our door to ask for LNG.
Carolyn Cochrane is the former Northwest Territories Premier. She also believes that natural resources can help Canada weather the Trump storm, but it requires investment and a government that doesn't ignore the North's potential.
We should be talking by Canadian all the time, and the Northwest Territories is well known for the critical minerals that we have here. We'd love to be able to get them to market, but we need help doing that. I believe Canada needs to put a larger investment into the infrastructure in the north.
So when you talk about infrastructure, you talk about roads as an example, but obviously you're talking much more. What is that? Computer laydown? Is that electricity? What exactly are you referring to when you say infrastructure?
Absolutely, like you said, I mean, the roads was the most prominent experience through our evacuation, where people were afraid of losing their lives. It was extremely traumatizing for people. But we also lack in telecommunications. I know even getting on today I had a lot of technical difficulties, even delayed when I'm talking here and watching. So just in general, the buildings, the support, the communications.
Now, the Trump threat does have Canadians looking for other markets. And as we heard, there is a role for the next Prime Minister and the next government to help make that happen. But the Premier's also brought up internal trade and the need for leadership in that file as well.
Maybe this is an opportunity for a fire to be lit under those conversations at the Premier's table. So I think it's a worthwhile endeavor to go back at it and see if there are some tangible wins that we can come up with.
According to a 2025 study from the John Deutsch Institute at Queen's University, reducing internal trade barriers could boost Canada's GDP by as much as $161 billion per year. And for decades, there have been unsuccessful attempts to do away with them, but don't suggest that nothing's been accomplished to Kathleen Wynne.
To be fair, there have been conversations at the Premier's table. There were structures set up. For example, when I was at the Council of the Federation table, we set up a dispute resolution mechanism that would allow, when there was an interprovincial conflict around either a regulation or the crossing of goods across provincial boundaries, that there would be a way to resolve those conflicts. So I think it's unfair to say that nothing has been done. I think it needs to be an ongoing conversation, and where there are ways that we can make sure that there's free movement of goods and people, then we should do that. But there are entrenched interests, in various industries, and we often go to alcohol. So whether it's wine or beer, those interests have to be heard, and there needs to be some way of making sure that we don't hurt the industries in each other's provinces, and that's where the rubber hits the road on those conversations, Michael.
On achieving the dream of the economic union in Canada by knocking down the remaining barriers to interprovincial trade and mobility in goods, services, and labor. A lot of that is a boring, grinding piece of work, which is regulatory harmonization. Nobody's ever going to win a vote or an election promising interprovincial regulatory harmonization. It's a very wonky issue. But there's one thing we could do to get big gains on that right away, which would be an agreement between the provinces to recognize each other's regs. So you would have reciprocal recognition of all the province's regs of professionals, labor market, transportation, you name the industry. There might be some things where you have to allow for exceptions, but they should be very rare, and we need to get cooking with gas on that.
And Anita Anand, who until recently was the Internal Trade Minister, said in early March that unprecedented progress had been made on that file since Trump launched his trade war. With inter-provincial barriers on alcohol expected to fall sometime this spring in all jurisdictions except PEI, and a proposal by June for recognizing labor certifications in all Canadian jurisdictions no matter what province or territory those credentials were given. So big challenges and work to be done for whoever will be the next Prime Minister, all with an unpredictable, unorthodox president in the U.S. White House, casting a shadow on the future livelihoods and prosperity of millions of people here in Canada.
My advice would be to stay in close communication with each other, to make sure that information was shared, to make sure that whatever proposals are bubbling up in our own bureaucracies in province and territories, that we share those, that we see if we can find common ground in terms of the strategies that we put forward, and make sure that we, as I said before, that we're on the same page and that we're supporting the federal government in their attempts, and that we communicate with the federal government, because that nobody wants surprises in a situation like this. We all want to know what each of us is going to be saying, so that we can have a coordinated approach.